We're back with another episode of really difficult Sega Genesis games. This time I wanted to spin off the series to cover the Genesis CD-ROM attachment, the Sega CD. It had its fair share of really hard games, and we are going to take a look at 7 of them in this episode. They range from a couple of full-motion video games, to a combat racing game, to even a few beat-em-ups. I hope you guys enjoy really difficult Sega Genesis games, the Sega CD edition. Most of you are quite familiar with my disgust for the Genesis version of Batman Returns. I always felt it was a poor playing, poor looking, and poor sounding piece of software that did the Genesis no justice at all. But when the Sega CD version of the game was released, it included quite possibly the best bonus content the Sega CD platform would ever see. This would come in the form of vehicular combat stages where you had set amount of time to dispatch a varying number of enemies and even a few boss fights. These sections looked and ran beautifully, showing off the technical prowess of the Sega CD hardware. Whenever anyone says the Sega CD couldn't have done a great home version of Outrunners, I point to this game as evidence to the contrary. When harnessed by the correct developer, the hardware sprite and background scaling of the Sega CD was quite effective. But along with this visual showcase came a level of difficulty that was truly brutal. The first few Batmobile stages are fairly doable with a little practice. Once you learned how to ram the enemies to not take damage and used your rockets at the best time, you could get pretty far. Some of the boss enemies could be a pain, but like any other game, learning their patterns were the key to success. But everything changed in the sewers when the environment itself became your worst enemy. Now the game was almost purely about your timing and memory, and it was absolutely unforgiving when it came to mistakes. I was stuck in these damn sewers for months trying to beat the game, failing time and time again. It got so bad that I actually broke out the cheats to get back to the levels that were kicking my ass, just so I didn't have to fight back through the Batmobile stages every time. The exacting nature of the gameplay really hammered me, especially the sections where things started moving. I have beaten this game twice in my life, and each time it came with nothing but pain and suffering. It's one of the platform's greatest visual accomplishments, but it also will destroy everyone that isn't ready for the commitment to see its end. Whenever the subject of full-motion video games comes up, most of the time the discussion centers on quality. Some liked them, some hated them. What you rarely hear about is just how hard some of these games can be. Since shooting real-time video and drawing animations was expensive, most full-motion video games are actually extremely short. To combat this, the developers would make them really hard. And one of my first brushes with this difficulty came in Avenger. Based on the 1985 Laserdisc arcade game from Data East, you are out to get some revenge for the killing of your wife. An outlaw road gang will battle you through 9 levels of hell, with deaths coming fast and often. The gameplay is pretty easy to come to terms with just 3 things you need to worry about. First were the left and right directions you had to steer the car. Second was the brake, and lastly there was a turbo button. The game was pretty forgiving early on, but quickly became quite difficult. Each new section of animation introduced a new place to die, and you needed to remember each and every one of them, then execute perfectly timed button or directional presses in order to move on. Time and time again the deaths would pile up, and this one could become frustrating to the point of madness. The game is truly fun and I love the theme here, but I can't lie and say it hasn't beaten me to a pulp many times. There is a cheat mode that will allow you to practice the harder stages, and a demo mode that will let you see the game played through to the end. I confess that I was not able to beat this all the way through until I discovered the level select cheat and was able to practice the later stages over and over until I perfected them. I'm actually pretty good at this now, but I wouldn't recommend playing it seriously on anything less than original hardware and a CRT. Input lag takes an already hard game and pushes it to one that is nearly impossible. There are those out there that can beat this even with the on-screen prompts turned off, and that, my friends, is truly amazing. On a side note, the guy that oversaw the animation in this game also was behind Transformers the movie. The Sega CD version of Out of This World came in a package that included its sequel and was called Heart of the Alien. It wasn't the first time I had played the game, but it was the first version I genuinely sat down and tried to beat. There are few games I've played that started out as hard as this one. After the incredible opening is over, you are dropped into this game's crazy world, and death awaits you. From the first moment you have control over the character, death is hunting you. It will tirelessly pursue you in each area, and no matter how many times you fall victim to it, it happily returns to take you time and time again. No joke, this game is really hard. The gameplay is all timing and trial and error, but there really isn't any sections where you can rest. Every single new screen you see usually has something on it that can easily kill you. No life bar, no second chances, insta kills everywhere. The visual presentation and soundtrack kept me going despite this level of difficulty, but the frustration was unbelievable. Like most games, the more you play it, the better you get, but the unforgiving gameplay always allows death to loom on the tiniest mistakes. Luckily, the game is fairly short, meaning you can beat it after a fair amount of time investment. The second game in the Sega CD bundle is even worse with less intuitive gameplay. Out of This World definitely had my number though, and is as much a death simulator as it is a video game. You know, I never considered Final Fight to be a hard arcade game. You tried to get as far as you could on your credit, and then you simply dropped another one once you were out of lives. I remember me and my buddies only needing a few dollars a piece to beat it, adding to the illusion that my incredible level of skill allowed it. It wasn't until the game came home that I first started to understand how hard the game really was. The Sega CD version included all the stages from the arcade, and even the two-player co-op that was sorely missing from the original Super Nintendo release. I was so excited when it was first released, completely unprepared for the slaughtering I was about to take. The Sega CD version gives you 5 men for its 4 continues. You'll likely blow through the first few stages without too much trouble, but later stages are much longer and have many more enemies that need killing. By the time you get to the last stage, you have used some of your continues, and the flow of enemies keeps pressure on you constantly. I'd fail time and time again in the last area, running out of continues on a nearly regular basis. Of course, time and repetition allowed me to get good enough to beat this one eventually, but that initial period was pretty damn tough. I realized, of course, that the big difference was that I was trying to do it alone in this version of the game, and I always had a buddy with me in the arcade. I'd go back and try to beat the arcade alone with only 4 credits later on, and had all kinds of trouble there too. The arcade has even more enemies on screen at the same time too, meaning that unless you are in co-op, be ready for one hell of a fight in that last stage. I remember the first time I saw Dragon's Lair in the arcade. It straight up blew me the hell away. The animation and visual appeal was incredible, so when home systems finally became capable of doing it, I was right there to give it a go. Much like the arcade version, this one is really hard too. Even after a fair amount of practice, it's really easy to mistime a reaction and die. I was never able to beat it legitimately, and didn't see the ending until I discovered a glorious cheat that played the whole game for you. Let's take a look at some of my many deaths. When Bram Stoker's Dracula landed on the Sega CD, I was ecstatic. Castlevania Bloodlines had not yet been released on the Genesis, so I figured with its source material being fighting the evil Count Dracula, this was going to be as close as I was going to get to the Konami juggernaut on a Sega system. And I was even blown away when I first started playing it. The visual style here looks almost 2.5D, with incredible depth in its backgrounds. I couldn't believe how great it looked, and was driven to see more of the game based almost solely on that. It didn't take long for me to realize though that this game played like absolute dog shit. The control of your character was slow and unresponsive, and the sluggish movement of the backgrounds didn't help. Enemies would come out in waves and were way faster than you or your attacks. This led to incredible frustration, and the game just gets worse as you get further in. Wave after wave of increasingly faster and more aggressive enemies chip away at your life bar. You'll repeat the first few areas dozens of times just trying to get your timing down to keep the hordes of bats and rats at bay. And with no save feature and tons of stages, the time investment to see the ending of this was unreal. You've often heard me speak about games that are hard because they were designed to be, and then there are games that are hard because of awful design. This fits the latter case, adding a frustration to the experience that isn't easily overlooked. I was a fan of Sylvester Stallone's movies when I was a kid. I always did love an action movie, and his Rocky films had been around since my first memories of the cinema. When Cliffhanger was released on the Sega CD, and I read it was a beat-em-up akin to favorites like Streets of Rage, I wanted to add it to my collection immediately. Unfortunately, any similarities to Streets of Rage ends at the genre they share, because this game is not in the same league in regards to quality at all. The gameplay is noticeably sluggish with hitboxes on you and enemies that simply make playing the game a chore. Enemies are temporarily invincible every single time you knock them down, and have attacks that are faster and more varied than the simple punches and kicks you possess. I found out pretty quickly that the overpowered jump kick of yours was the only reliable way to defeat your enemies. But I'm the type of gamer that despises using the same move over and over again to beat a game. This led to me trying to actually fight my way through the game, and man did I take an ass whooping doing it. To make matters worse, the options screen has a number of lives and continues you can adjust, but they are locked together. You want more lives, you get less continues. You want more continues, you get less lives. But the real kick in the sack comes when you get to the snowboarding stages. These areas are unforgiving and full of insta-deaths. You'll tear through your lives on these stages quickly, and each death means starting over at the beginning. This game simply isn't good enough to put up with this kind of irritation, so thank goodness it has a stage skip that you can take advantage of. The Stallion really let me down on this one. The Sega CD of course has many more difficult games, so if you enjoyed this, please let me know down in the comments so I can get to making another one of these. Hell, I could do an episode like this comprised entirely of full motion video games. Some of those are so crazy difficult that they'll drive you insane trying to beat them. There's also a few shoot 'em ups on the system that are quite hard. Of the games I covered here, I recommend Batman Returns, Final Fight, and Road Avenger as must-plays. They're hard but worth the effort, and all three have soundtracks worth ripping to your phone. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.